Welcome to the Chinese Buddhist Studies series of author interviews on the 2025 collection of essays, Readings of the Gateless Barrier, edited by Jimmy Yu. My name is Bryan Lowe. I'm from Princeton University, and I'm here today very excited to be talking to Marta Sanvido, an assistant professor at Yale, who specializes in Japanese Zen. We're going to discuss her really outstanding chapter, From Secrecy to Openness, the Gateless Barrier in Premodern Japanese Zen. So, Marta, I thought it might be interesting for both me and for the listeners and viewers to learn a little bit about you and kind of how you relate to this research. So, could you tell us about how you first got interested in Japanese Buddhism?
Yes, of course. First of all, thank you so much, Bryan, for being here with me today. I start by saying that I've followed your scholarship for many years and I admire your work. So it's a real honor to have this opportunity to discuss my chapter with you today. So people maybe can tell from my accent, but I grew up in Italy, precisely in northern Italy. I actually got interested in Buddhism when I was in college. I major in Japanese studies, so the way in which this works in Italy, basically we have to decide our college major before starting college. And I was interested in Japan for a number of reasons. The first was that in high school, I discovered Japanese literature, pretty much very famous authors like Murakami Haruki, Kawabata Yasunari, and so on. And then, like many people from my generation, I grew up watching Japanese anime. So Japan was this fascinating world that seems so far away and yet so familiar to some extent. And so I decided to major in Japanese studies and Japanese. I also wanted to focus more on the humanities because we also have majors in high school, and I major in Italian corporate law and finance, so something completely different from what I ended up doing. I was very tired of that. I wanted to just do humanities stuff because I love literature and culture and philosophy. And so that's why I ended up majoring in Japanese studies, which included all of these things together. When I was a freshman in college, I took an introduction to Japanese Buddhism. And that was the first time when I met Dogen and his famous work, the Shobogenzo. And I remember we were assigned a chapter from the Shobogenzo, a very famous one, which is in Japanese, the Genjo Koan, translated in English as the realized koan. For me, it was really absolutely mind-blowing, this idea that when he says something very, very famous, something like that, studying the way of the Buddha is to study yourself, to study yourself is to forget yourself, and to forget yourself is being verified by the old Dharma. So this idea that, means and goal are just one. I got really in love with Dogen and the Shobogenzo at the time. And so I asked this professor who was faculty member in Venice, and he then became my mentor throughout my whole academic career in Italy, Aldo Tollini, about Dogen and the Shobogenzo. He translated several fascicles from this work. And when I asked him about that, he was so excited that he right away decided to introduce me to the scholarship first in English, and then he guided me through, the study of classical Japanese, because he made clear from the very beginning that if you want to work on this stuff, you must be able to work on the primary sources. This is the most important thing. So it's really thanks to him if I then decided to continue studying Buddhism and Zen specifically, because he is actually a fantastic mentor and took my interest very seriously, even though I knew absolutely nothing about Buddhism at the time. So yeah, that's pretty much how it started. And I'm still working on Soto Zen. So it's been a very long time kind of passion, interest, and love.
Well, I think one of the things about Soto Zen, I mean, and really the whole Buddhist tradition, is it's also kind of endlessly complex and rich that you can easily spend probably an entire career, an entire lifetime, in multiple lifetimes, and still not master it all. You mentioned Dogen when you were just speaking, who of course is a really famous, probably arguably today the most famous Japanese Zen monk. And I know this is like a really impossible task, but I thought maybe to make sure like all of the viewers and listeners are kind of on the same page, would it be possible to have you just like briefly outline a little bit about the history of Zen in Japan? Like how did Zen enter Japan? What are some of the main schools? And just like a little tiny bit of background knowledge on Zen and how it reached Japan?
Course, it's a very big responsibility. So I'll try to do my best. I have to cut a few things because I mean we can stay here for the whole afternoon, but I'll try to do my best. Um, so I mean, when we say Zen, the word Zen itself, we know that in the Japanese context, it can have, let's say, at least two meanings. The first one is which comes from dhyana in Sanskrit and then jhana in Pali, which is like concentration or meditation. So we can actually trace two sort of like vectors of transmission. One is like how meditation was transmitted to Japan, and then how then Zen Buddhism became an institutionalized tradition in the Japanese religious landscape. So if we want to trace the transmission of meditation, Zen, like sort of proto-Chan meditation to Japan, we can say that it arrived as early as the 7th century with a monk named Dosho who went to China and he studied with a very famous monk, the monk pilgrim Xuanzang, and a disciple of the second Chinese Chan patriarch Huike. Huike was a successor of Bodhidharma, the legendary founder of Chan. Then later on, Dosho returned to Japan and he established one of the six Nara Buddhist schools known as the Hosso school, which is based on Yogacara Buddhism. And at the same time, he also established a meditation hall at Gangoji, which is a temple in Nara. So we knew that they practiced meditation. Later on, another monk coming from China, known as Daoshuan, was invited to Japan, and Daoshuan was a monk from the North Chan. So he was actually invited to Japan to transmit and establish monastic discipline, but then he also brought with him some of the practices of Northern Chan, which of course included meditation. And we know that one of his disciples passed down this lineage to the founder of Tendai Buddhism, Saicho. So these are two major figures if we want to trace sort of like how meditation got started in Japan. A Japanese scholar named Sueki Fumihiko, he actually said that Zen started in Japan during the Nara period, although it's not institutional Zen, but that's how pretty much the first historical steps that we see. If we want to trace the second vector of how like Zen was transmitted to Japan in its institutional form, we have to wait until the 12th century. So during this time, usually the historical narrative is that during this time, Zen Buddhism established as part of the so-called new Buddhist school that developed during the Kamakura period in the 12th century. We know now that the schools were not so new in reality because they kept very close ties and also visible signs of continuity with what was already there in terms of Buddhism, that is Shingon Buddhism and Tendai Buddhism. One of the major figures of this development of institutional Zen in Japan is actually Eisai or Yosai, who is recognized as the founder of Rinzai Zen. And he was actually a Tendai monk. He had a background as a Tendai monk. We know that he went to China twice, one in 1168 and the other one in 1187. This actually was very rare time because we have to imagine that going to China was extremely dangerous. It was also pretty expensive, right, to find patrons that could sponsor these trips. So the fact that Eisai went to China twice is actually something unique. I also have to say that the second time he wanted to go to India, that was his final destination, but he was unable to do so due to bad weather conditions. So he actually stopped in China, where he actually studied, among other things, monastic regulations and meditation. Then when he went back to Japan, he established a temple that is called Shofukuji, which is in Hakata, a town in the southern island of Kyushu. At the time, Eisai met with the opposition from his previous Dharma brothers at Mount Ye, which is the headquarters of Tendai Buddhism. Later on, he was at the beginning of the 13th century, he was appointed as the abbot of Kenninji by the shogunate. And here we find a bit sort of like Eisai's approach to Zen, which was very accommodating, we can say. He tried to combine Zen practices such as meditation, as well as performance of rituals that originated within the Shingon and Tendai context. So we find a mix of different components. Just a very small curiosity, maybe our listeners or viewers know Eisai for also another thing, which is that he was credited with the beginning of tea tradition in Japan. There is a very good book by James Ben who explains tea culture in China and also explains the role of Eisai in the transmission of tea to Japan and its historical implications. It is said that he actually brought back to Japan brought back to Japan from China green tea seeds, and he wrote a treatise where he explored the medical aspect of tea drinking. Simply speaking, he saw tea as the bitter flavor, which was missing from Japanese diet, and according to the Chinese medical system, this bitter flavor was especially good for the heart, so it was good for Buddhist practice. The second major figure of Japanese Buddhism that I mentioned before is, of course, Dogen, the founder of Soto Zen Buddhism. So, like Eisai, as I said before, these monks had very close ties with Tendai Buddhism. So, Dogen started his monastic career at Mount Ihe, the headquarters of Tendai Buddhism. The hagiographies said that he was very unhappy with Tendai practice. This is a very hagiographic trope where, Zen monks or other monks became very unhappy with Tendai or like Shingon practice. And so they decided to move to other schools. This is when he met a monk from Kenninji, Myozen, who succeeded Eisai in the abbotship of the temple. And eventually in 1223, he was able to go to China. Once in China, Dogen again was unhappy with the study of koan. We know that his work, he was very, very knowledgeable. He has a very deep knowledge of koan, but he was also very critical of it. So he wondered why people don't study the sutra, the actual scriptures. And then it was where he met his master, Rujing. And he became so impressed with Rujing's frugal life and his disciples that were so dedicated to meditation that he went back to Japan and decided to sort of like establish this practice in Japan as well. A few years after going back to Japan, he founded his famous monastery, Eiheiji, which is in Fukui Prefecture, in the middle of the mountains. This was a very interesting choice at the time because he decided consciously to establish his own monastery and monastic community, basically in the middle of nowhere. Way far away from the centers of power, even though Dogen did have very important connection with influential patrons at the time. Nevertheless, he went in the middle of the mountains. And this is very... I just forgot that I have to mention the Gozan monasteries, which I don't want to skip the part on Gozan. I mean, Gozan developed as part of Rinzai Zen is more like a ranking system. I'm mentioning this right now because it might be helpful to understand koan practice later on. It was basically, I mean, this is a ranking system that was introduced by the Hojo Regency and was supported by the military government. So the way in which Gozan Monastery worked was that they were sort of like ministries that use a kind of like nationwide network of temples for the distribution of government laws and norms and for monitoring, for example, local conditions of the military, different military retainers. The reason why Gozan temples are important and the temples part of the Gozan system are important is because they became centers for the study of Chinese classics and Chinese culture. This is because usually monks, Chan monks traveling from China, they would actually stay in these monasteries, part of the Gozan system. And this became sort of like the centers where monks could study, for example, Chinese poetry, and they had a really high proficiency of classical Chinese. So it was like the academic side of like very, very academic and scholastic side of Zen Buddhism.
I'm so delighted, Marta, that you started the story in like kind of the seventh and eighth centuries. As someone who specializes in those periods, I think everything cool and interesting started at that time. So I was happy to hear you kind of trace the origins of Zen there as well. One of the things that I thought is really interesting, kind of listening to you talk right now, is the way that Zen, in some ways, is kind of being imported from China with both Chinese monks and Japanese pilgrims, but also very much integrated into Japanese culture, into a world where the Tendai institutions and worldviews are dominant. And you really kind of start to see this mixing and this new form of Japanese Zen emerging that's distinct maybe from what existed in China, at least to some degree. And one of the things I think that you highlight in your chapter that was like so fascinating and I thought so important to me is what you call a culture of secrecy, in your words. And I think in general, like secrecy isn't something that like people usually associate with Zen. Even like when I teach Zen to my students in my classes, secrecy doesn't come up much, like if at all. So I was curious if you could say a little bit about what you mean by a culture of secrecy and how it relates to Japanese Zen and like why so much secrecy?
I also skip the secrecy part when I teach Zen in my classes, and I probably shouldn't do that since that's, my research topic. But that's a great question. So when I say culture of secrecy, I actually borrowed this term from a book that came out, I think, 20 years ago in 2006 or so, and is an edited volume for anyone who's interested in this topic. That's a wonderful point of reference that was edited by Marta and Bernard Scheid. They collected several essays on Japanese secrecy, and they came up with this term because we know that around the sort of like 12th, 11th century, actually, we see this practice of transmitting knowledge as oral instructions or confidential instructions. And this became a sort of like major way of producing and transmitting knowledge for many centuries. This practice can be traced back to Tendai Buddhism, which we should understand by now is actually very important to understand the whole Japanese Buddhist landscape. I can recall the wonderful book that is by Professor Jacqueline Stone, Original Enlightenment, and she actually traces the development of this culture of secrecy within Tendai as the development of two major factors. One is the aristocratization of Tendai Buddhism, which is the fact that members from noble families, they joined monastic ranks, they became monks. Many of them established their own temples on the mountains, which were supported by private estates. These estates were donated by them to the patron families whom they served as ritual specialists and with whom they maintained close ties. So we have, first of all, the members of the aristocracy who established this like personal temples, we can say. And this actually is strictly connected to the second development, which is the privatization of knowledge that we see during this time. We see that powerful aristocratic family privatized land, political authority, cultural knowledge, and religious expertise as well. So this actually led to the emergence of rival Buddhist lineages, or at least like rival like little centers of power that emerged as members of competing aristocratic factions who took monastic vows and established their own private cloisters. So we have this kind of proliferations of smaller lineages, right? Each of which wanted to produce their own distinctive interpretation of certain scriptures and of the rituals and so on, and where the relationship between master and disciple become absolutely central. And so this is where secrecy comes into play, because secrecy became a way, first of all, to establish the identities of these lineages. Each of them had specific characteristics, right? And secondly, these characteristics, that is, the ability to produce secrets and distinctive interpretations about either rituals or doctrines, became a way to attract disciples. So these two things went hand in hand. Another thing I wanted to point out is that when I say culture of secrecy, it's because this was not limited to Buddhism. We see that, the production of secrets that became the norm for poetic lineages, for example, for no practitioners. So we see pretty much secrets everywhere proliferating here and there. And usually, we can assume that some of these people actually had sort of like communication and exchanges with one another. And so we see a sort of like cross-pollination of secrets where, for example, in the case of Zen, some esoteric Buddhism elements were included in Zen secret documents, for example. In the case of Zen, of course, Zen was influenced, and Buddhism was influenced by these first developments that we see in Tendai Buddhism. But what actually, like I said before, what makes secrecy so important for Zen lineages is that we have many subfactions within either Rinzai Buddhism or Soto Zen Buddhism. This is especially visible in the case of Soto Zen, which developed regionally and locally, establishing smaller sublineages, and each of them actually, they created their own interpretations of koan, for example, and their own interpretation of doctrine. And this was pretty much the core of secrecy. It was both a way to establish this lineage's identity, but also a way to, keep sort of like some level of keep appealing their teachings for prospect disciples.
This is fascinating, but you did something very, very terrible there, which is you made me feel old. I had to check that The Culture of Secrecy really came out in 2006. I still think of that as like a new, exciting book.
Is that correct?
It is. I looked. You are completely
okay.
correct. It came out in 2006, which is indeed 20 years ago, and I feel like I just read it not that long ago, and it's made me feel my years. But despite the sin you've committed, I think it was a really helpful answer, because I think one of the things you really showed us is that, kind of directly to my earlier question about how Zen kind of becomes Japanese and fits into Japanese culture, is that this culture of secrecy was so broad. I mean, extending into no theater and all these other different domains of knowledge. So I think that's kind of a really interesting and surprising way that like Zen changes and is different from the way that we I guess even you and I kind of, teach about Zen to our students. You alluded to this a little bit at the end, but I kind of want to ask you to go a little bit deeper. So you mentioned how kind of there becomes secrecy with koan interpretation and kind of master-disciple relationships. Could you just say like a little bit more? Because of course your chapter is in this book about this koan collection, The Gateless Barrier. Could you say a little bit more about how secrecy might kind of shape koan interpretation and just how that works?
That's a great question. To just answer this question, I have a bit to go back on, how koan study was when it first started in Japan. So something that we have to understand is that the practice was transmitted, of course, from China, right? So they wanted to follow the norms and the rules that we find in Chinese commentarial tradition, for example, how koan were commented and interpreted in collections such as the Blue Cliff Record. So the idea was that teachers and disciples had to exchange question and answers in a Chinese order, and students' understanding was tested by the ability to bring up the proper appended verses that were in Chinese. These appended verses were usually taken from different Chinese works. We have connection with the literati culture, for example. So the problem here is that to master the ability of commenting on koan in the Chinese manner, one had to master Chinese language because it required people to be able to cite these verses are, at the top of their head. And even though some Japanese monks who traveled to China at first, many of them had a very impressive mastery of Chinese language, this was not true for everyone, especially as we move forward with the development of Zen in Japan. So while in Gozan monasteries, they were able to keep up with their tradition because of the study of Chinese classics, the presence of Chinese monks who traveled to Japan. So they kept a more scholastic approach to Zen. In Soto and Rinzai monasteries, which are known under the sort of label of Rinka, which is beneath the grove, Rinka refers to Soto and Rinzai, so all the temples that are not part of the Gozan ranking system. In this case, we can say that koan practice developed based on three major characteristics. The first one is a standardized koan curriculum. This is because it was physically and absolutely impossible for monks to master the whole koan repertoire. It was way too vast, included way too many appended verses, way too many koans, and the amount of memorization that was required was absolutely impossible to deal with, especially for people who had basic proficiency of Chinese, but not enough to be able to, be spontaneous in that language, if you want to say that. So this takes us to the second characteristic, which is that the practice of koan in these groups became a sort of formalized set of answers and questions based on the Chinese sayings that could be memorized. And lastly, the method that was used to exchange this was secrecy. So the records of these exchanges between master and disciples were kept secret. I have to say that although there isn't much spontaneity when it comes to this kind of exchanges between master and disciple, if we look at these records that we have. In some of these traditions, specifically Soto Zen, but also Genju, which is a sub-lineage of the Rinzai school, after the exchange between master and disciples, sometimes, actually often, we find that they added a commentary in vernacular Japanese to the case. And so this is where we have what we can say, it might be an overstatement, but this is where we have the more juicy part, the secrets, right? Where they added their own interpretation of the koan case. And usually this interpretation just borrow from here and there from elements and components that were broadly part of what we called before the culture of secrecy. And so this is why the exchange of secrets in the context of koan practice became so important, because it was a way to keep the knowledge between master and disciples, or at least within the lineage. And some groups developed distinctive interpretations of this koan. I mentioned in my chapter the case of Genju Zen, which became actually pretty, now it's discussed about more frequently. There's been a book by a professor from Chicago, Stefan Licha, who also discusses this cane and Genju Zen within the broader context of the connection between esoteric Buddhism and Zen. What is interesting here is that we have as a sort of blueprint, hermeneutical blueprint to how to interpret the case, embryology, which is another component of esoteric Buddhism in Japan. Basically, this idea that the realization, right, was going back to the womb, where the encounter between the father and mother fluids was like the expression of non-duality. I think that for people studying Buddhism these days, this might be very unfamiliar frameworks, and I'm aware of that. I discussed embryology in one of my classes a few weeks ago, and the students were like, never heard of this. What is that? So, but we have to imagine that the kind of like frameworks and references that they had at the time is different from the ones that we have today, which are indebted from, for example, the reform that happened during the Tokugawa period. So the Zen that we know today is the Zen that was reformed and changed during Tokugawa period, because during the medieval years, things were a bit different than the one that we are familiar with.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the really exciting things about your work and Stefan Leach's work, and just to plug, he has a book that came out maybe 2 years ago called Esoteric Zen, published with Brill, is how radically different our view of Zen kind of is in the wake of your scholarship and Stefan's scholarship. We've started to see that Zen isn't just this kind of, you know, collection of people spontaneously challenging each other. And it doesn't even look like, as recent scholars have reassessed how it looks in China, rather kind of Japanese Zen monks they're interested in secrecy, they're interested in esotericism, they're interested in embryology in the womb. And it's a really, really different perspective that's, I think, unfamiliar to a lot of our viewers and listeners. I want to go back to the point you were making about kind of when secrecy ended, but before that, I want to dig a little bit deeper on, I think, something else that is probably a little bit unexpected to people that are unfamiliar with this kind of revisionist scholarship, which is this notion of like a kind of a religious curriculum in Zen. In particular, you know, you mentioned briefly just a moment ago these manuals with like standardized answers that people could kind of read and memorize. And when I first learned about these, I remember being really, really surprised because the popular understanding of Zen is it should be spontaneous, right?
Yeah.
So could you say a little bit more like what is the role of these kind of manuals? What do they look like? Why do they have them? I know you addressed this a little bit, but I'd love to have you expand on it. And just like to like in the kind of imagined critic's view, I could see perhaps a Zen practitioner saying like, this is just kind of fake Zen. This is artificial. This is kind of bunk. It's not real true Zen, which is spontaneous. And I was curious if you could kind of like defend medieval Zen a little bit against these attacks. Like why have these manuals and these kind of answer keys? How does that fit into to learning the true spirit of Zen?
A great question. So what you're saying about a possible critique to this, like manuals as being, not spontaneous enough as we would expect them to be, was a critique that was actually moved by some Obaku Zen, which is another like lineage of Zen that arrived in Japan during the early modern period. And we read in some of their records that they were so disappointed with Japanese Zen monks because they were so attached to their records of koan exchange with their masters. It was like their little treasure. And they said, if you take these records away from them, they don't know how to respond to a koan. They don't know how to exchange, like answer, question and answer with a master. Of course, these monks traveled from China, where maybe the practice took where probably the practice took a different turn. I want to defend a bit the manuals that we have about like what was called misan, so the confidential exchange between master and disciple that were secret. So it is true that memorization of appended verses were the norm and was something required. The way in which we can see this, and I'm borrowing this explanation from William Bodiford, who's like very famous scholar of Soto Zen Buddhism. He wrote Soto Zen in Medieval Japan, which is like the very fundamental work for anyone who wants to approach Soto Zen. So he compares the memorization of these verses to drills that were used in modern language instructions. The idea is that at first you might not understand what you're saying, right? You just repeat what you're said to you, what the master tells you to say. But at some point, upon repeating again and again, you started to learn the technique and how it was supposed to be. And from there, you develop the ability to comment on the koan. On the question of spontaneity, I think that's more like our expectation of Zen than how it was actually supposed to be. Like being able to comment on a koan requires deep study of the case, require like constant practice, right? So the idea that someone came up with this like interpretations of out of nowhere is a bit an expectation that is a bit out of place, if you will. Is like expecting a first-year grad student to develop the most like radical theory about a problem that no scholar was able to figure out up to that point. So, everything requires study, and that's no different for koan as well. As I mentioned before, I would like to like really emphasize that although it is true that appended verses were memorized and even phrase books were created. So there were like these phrase books from which you could pick the appended verses, and these were a limited number, so it was easier for memorization. However, these monks added their own interpretation. They played a bit with the sort of like image that the koan can offer us. Again, the example in my chapter, which is again from Genju, is the fifth koan from the Gateless Barrier. So the fifth case of the Gateless Barrier, we have this man up in a tree, right, hanging onto a branch by his teeth, with his hands and feet not touching the tree branches. And beneath the tree, there's someone who asks him, what is the meaning of the first patriarch, which is Bodhidharma coming from the West, a very famous and a typical Chan question. The problem here is that if he answers the questions, he falls, right? Because he's just there with his teeth. But if he does not answer, he proves that he does not know what's the meaning of that. Now, I mean, we can picture in our head this man hanging onto a branch by his teeth, this figure, and they did that in Genju Zen, and they came up with the idea that this man resembled a fetus, an embryo curled up inside the mother's womb. So the kind of technique that we see is sort of like interpretation based on correlation, right? On like seeing the image that the koan gives you and going into to a completely like different direction than the beginning of the koan, which shows that koan can be used to interpret different things. This is not part of my chapter, but what I want to point out is that this embryological image that we find in the fifth case of Genju Zen is also common to Soto Zen. And in Soto Zen, the koan was used for, again, another completely different interpretative goal, which is making sense of sort of like the ontological status of women who died during childbirth, because the general understanding was that, these women were impure and that they would be reborn in hell, right? Because of parturition blood. And so the monk was supposed to save them. What the ritual explanation says is that when the monk approaches this kind of women, they have to see them from the perspective of non-duality, right? And from the fact that this woman is the where the fifth case takes place. So there's no dualism between the embryo and the woman. They are the same. And so, I mean, the kind of, like passages of interpretation takes pretty wild kind of turns. And this is an example just to say that, yes, they did memorize appended verses, but that doesn't mean that's all they do. They actually came up with very creative interpretation of koan.
When I'm hearing your answer, it kind of reminds me of something that I try to kind of talk to my students about a lot, which is we are often surprised to learn about these different ways about approaching koan, but that's kind of our problem. Like we want the koan to make sense to us in like a, North American, European context. But what is the point of studying Zen if we're just going to take our own kind of frameworks and then apply them to these stories, right? And I heard two really kind of interesting, I think, lessons from your remarks. One is like hermeneutics is very much culturally defined, right? The rules for how we interpret a passage depend on the kind of the rules in which this of the society or culture that we live in. And in the medieval Japanese society, right, the hermeneutics are about embryology and esotericism, which is a different one from ours. And we need to kind of learn how to adopt these different vantage points. And then the other thing I think I heard that might be surprising that I just kind of want to reflect on is that we tend to think that in at least in people often in North America, Europe, maybe even in the modern world more generally, tend to think that learning and memorization are kind of antithetical to creativity, right? Like creativity and spontaneous happens like separate from all the books that you read. But in this worldview, right, like learning and memorization are the kind of the condition that enable creativity. Like you only can be creative when you've mastered the tradition. And what's happening in this medieval context is that mastery happens in this kind of master-disciple relationship, which is really different from the world we live in. And this world is like so determined, both I think in the hermeneutics and in the way that kind of the curriculum happened, is so steeped in secrecy um, in the medieval world in Japan. But even in Japan, of course, secrecy, like all things, is impermanent. It doesn't last forever. And one of the things, you allude to in your chapter title, and then you discuss in detail in your chapter, is that secrecy too kind of ends in Japan, at least to some degree, starting in around the 17th century. And there's a much more kind of open attitude towards Zen. So could you say a little bit more like both like why did secrecy end when it did, but also how does Zen change in this new world that is less secret than the medieval age?
Great question. I think, as an very representative example of when we say that secrecy ends, the Soto Zen school, where we have, I wanted to just add something to what I said before, and is that secret documents that we have left from either Rinzai and Soto are incredibly important historical documents. Because, in the case of Soto Zen, we still have left so many secret sources in the temple's archives, and they provide very unique perspective of what it was like to practice Zen, let's say in the 15th, 16th century, especially for monasteries that were so far away from the so-called centers of power. So they are also very valuable historical documents. Regarding the end of secrecy, I would say that the Edo period, so we are in like the beginning of the 17th century, marks a sort of like watershed moment when it comes to secrecy. In the specific case of Soto Zen, I wouldn't talk of like the end of secrecy, but definitely it was like sort of like kept under control sort of thing. Became way less prominent with the reform of the school. And the reform of the school was supported by a monk that is named Manzan, sorry. Manzan was very unhappy with the rules of Dharma transmission that were in place at the time in Soto Zen Buddhism. Very simply speaking, the way in which Dharma transmission worked was that when an abbot changed temple, becoming the abbot of another temple, they also had to discard their previous lineage and adopt the lineage of the new temple. So they had to change, right, lineages. And Manzan said that this is not, I'm talking within Soto Zen Buddhism, of course, so going from one temple to another. Mm. Manzan was not happy with that, and he said this is against Dogen's teachings, the Shobogenzo. So he was able to convince the Tokugawa government to regulate on this matter, and they regulated that the teachings of Dogen should be the standard for Soto school. And that's when, in Soto Zen, they rediscovered the founder, because the way in which Dogen was, let's say, available to them during this culture of secrecy was very different from the way in which we know the Shobogenzo today. Dogen's work was relevant, especially on matter of Dharma transmission and things related to Dharma transmission. But the Shobogenzo was little commented about during the medieval years, probably because it seemed very far away from the directions that the school took during the culture of secrecy, which is a very clear focus on koan, and we know that Dogen was not very positive about studying koan. Also during the early modern period, we have another monk, Menzan, who we can consider the first philology of Soto Zen, because he went around gathering fascicles of the Shobogenzo, and he tried to put together the whole work. He commented on it. And another thing that Menzan did was that he went to a Heiji and tried to catalog all the secret documents that were in there. And he provides a sort of annotated bibliography of the secret documents. And for, the large part of it, he was very negative about this secret sources, saying, oh, there's too many koans, it's too much esoteric Buddhism, this is not the identity of our school. And this is how secrecy, progressively faded in the school, because monks were now required to know the Shobogenzo, to study the Shobogenzo, and so transmitting secret documents as a reflection of their, lineage identity was not longer possible, because they had to align with a more coherent image of the school, which was the founder and his main work, the Shobogenzo. However, we also must consider that, at least in the case of Soto Zen, they continue to keep secret documents, and copy them as a sort of record of the past of their lineage, right? To keep them in the temples. And that's why we still have these documents available. But secrecy became less and less common progressively moving forward.
It's so interesting because, when we think of Soto Zen today, we think, of course, of Dogen and of the Shobogenzo. But for a large portion of Japanese Zen history, kind of as you've explained, that wasn't kind of what Zen was all about, right? It was about something quite different. I think this really reminds us that the things that we take to be central and original to the tradition are actually often the product of a very particular moment in time. And in this case, kind of early modern Japan, the Edo or Tokugawa period from the 17th through 19th century. And I would just kind of also highlight, I think, with this broader dissolution of secrecy kind of in Japanese culture as a whole. And as you talk about in your chapter, I mean, things like print culture and the emergence of kind of widespread printing, I think really play a role and really change things. I want to zoom in on one Edo period figure. You mentioned a minute ago talking about kind of Zen doctrines about gender and about the impurity of women and non-duality. And the part when I was reading your chapter, which I loved throughout, but I kind of really got excited about, was when I was reading about the figure Tachibana no Someko, because she's a rare example of a woman, not only of a woman that practiced Zen, but also a woman who kind of left behind very kindly of her sources for us to use so that we could understand her life. So could you tell us just a little bit about who was Tachibana no Someko and why is she important?
So actually, I found out about Someko's work when I was writing this chapter. And I mean, I'm very grateful to a couple of articles that a Japanese scholar named Sueki Fumihiko that I mentioned before wrote about women practicing Zen. And he also contributed to the English translation of her sort of autobiography, The Waste Paper Record, which unfortunately is very difficult to find because it was published in a small amount of copies. So it's very difficult to get that translation, but it's truly outstanding. So the reason why I decided to include, when it came to the Edo period, this idea of wider availability of koan, a woman, is because I was a little bit frustrated myself with, I do love the koan commentaries. I studied this kind of source for many years, and I love the whole secrecy word and universe. But of course, this is, kind of knowledge that was for monastics and was for male monastics. So we don't have women involved in this process. In the context of Soto Zen, there were some local warriors who were allowed to receive secret insights on koan, but still, we're talking about men. So I do wonder, is there any woman who ever practiced koan and left maybe something behind? That's when I encounter Professor Sueki's work on her. She was the life of a local warrior and was actually grew up rather familiar with Buddhism. Through this autobiography that she wrote, that was the waste paper record, we know that she practiced different sort of like Buddhist practices that included the recitation of Amida's name, the so-called Ninbutsu in Japanese. So she learned about the Pure Land. She learned a bit also about Shingon Buddhism. A moment, like a turning point moment in her life was when, at least that's what the autobiography says, when she lost 3 of her 4 children. And that's when her husband suggested her to go to this Rinzai temple that was very close from where they lived and meet this master, Ungan. We don't know much about him. And that's when she was introduced to the practice of koan, right? The way in which she explains koan in the waste paper record is that koan is something that sweeps away everything that you learn from the day you were born. And the purpose of learning koan and practices koan is not to accumulate knowledge, but is to perplex you. And that's what she's very good at doing. She puts forward very radical interpretation of some koan that actually shows a self-awareness of being a woman in early modern Japan. The commentary that I mentioned on the Gateless Barrier that I mentioned in my chapter can be translated, the title can be translated in English as A Bird's False Cry. So this is attributed to Sumiko. Is not, we actually, I mean, scholars came to the conclusion that is very likely her work based on the similarities with the waste paper record, because there's several overlapping. What is very interesting to me, at least about this writing, is that the commentarial style is very unique because she picks up a case, illustrates her own understanding of the case, and she uses references from like both some Chinese sources, but also and especially from Japanese literature. Like, you know, classical works can be the Tale of Genji, the Tsuretsure Guza. She mentions, you know, like famous like female writers from the past. So she connects to sort of like the Japanese or cultural literary tradition, and then she ends the koan with a poem that is in Japanese, a waka, which is very, very uncommon. So, you know, it's a very different way to comment on koan from the one that we see in secret manuals that were exchanged among like monastics. To some extent, is less formalized than what we have, but it's also interesting because she tries to make sense of her own life through koan. And the case that I actually explain a bit in the chapter just shows that she tried to move some critiques against the soteriological models that were used for women, right? She takes up the case 9 from the Gateless Barrier, which centers on a question that is: the Buddha of great penetration and supreme wisdom sat at the site of enlightenment for 10 kalpas, which is a super long period of time, but the Buddha Dharma did not appear to him. How was that he could not achieve the way? So it's like, okay, this Buddha just was there in meditation for so many like kalpas and such a long time, and he was unable to achieve awakening. So this is a sort of paradox. But she takes this paradox to talks about the potential of women on the Buddha's path. And she, first of all, compares women to a sort of rough stone, taking an episode from the Han Fei Zi, which is a text of Chinese legalism, a very foundational text, where we have this man who donates stone to the emperor, but then he was punished because it seemed like a worthless stone. In reality, the stone was a very precious stone of jade that just needed to be polished. And she uses this sort of like metaphor to talk about women, saying that women had full potential to awakening. They have full spiritual capacities. They just need that polishing. And that polishing means that monks should take them seriously and guide them, toward the koan path, because that's based on their own experience, right?
I love that she is able to kind of take the tools of this very patriarchal, quite literally patriarchal tradition, and then use them to kind of, solve her own problems and challenge that patriarchy in a lot of ways. And I also really appreciate what you were saying earlier about how she kind of understands the purpose of the koan as being to perplex you, because I think that's my own pedagogical style too. I tell my students I'm not going to give you answers necessarily, but you will be more confused, and hopefully more confused in a useful way by the end of the class. We're getting close to running out of time, so I was wondering if I could just end maybe by asking you to share a little bit with us of what you're working on now, or if you have anything to plug, maybe that's just come out that might tie into this chapter that people who read the chapter might want to read next.
So right now I'm finishing my first book, which I hope to finish soon because it's been a very long-term project, which is about the role of secrets in peripheral Soto Zen monasteries. I include some discussion on koan in my first book as well. However, I have to say that working on this chapter, and I'm very grateful to Jimmy who asked me to write this chapter on Japan, just convinced me to continue on this path of koan, and I'm probably also writing my second book on to like trace a sort of like cultural history of koan in Japan, what it means to practice koan in pre-modern Japan. And I hope to expand on the case of Tachibana no Someko. I'm actually working on the translation of this commentary, which is moving very slowly because I don't have much time, but I hope to provide at some point a translation in English, because I think it's interesting, I mean, for anyone working on Zen, but also for anyone who's interested in Zen or koan practice, to hear her voice and what it was like for a woman in the 18th century to practice, koan and approach Buddhism in a very different way from the way that we usually know.
Well, if Yale University is listening, I hope they can give you lots of sabbaticals so that you can produce both a book that will teach us about secrecy, a book to teach us more about
Send
the
this video to
transmission of
my
koan.
chair.
I will please
Thank you.
pass this on to your chair. We need 3 books. We need secrecy. We need more about koan transmission, and I definitely want to learn a whole lot more about Someko and be able to read a translation of her work. So this is all really exciting, and it's been so fun to talk to you. Everybody that's viewing and listening, a reminder, go out, buy the book, especially at your local bookstore, and read Marta's chapter. It's a really, really great chapter, and thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
It was such a pleasure talking with you. Thank you.